What's going on? This is Theo Gremminger, aka the OG Fantasy. Welcome back to another edition of Sleepers. We're looking at fantasy sleepers. A lot of these guys are players to stash. Some of these players you can put into your lineups. This week is not so bad with the buys. We only have two teams on bye week with Pittsburgh and Green Bay players not available. But next week is bye Mageddon. Carolina, Cincinnati, Dallas, Houston, the New York Jets, and the Tennessee Titans all on bye weeks. So a lot of you watch this show for like those last minute guys you can pick up off your free agent pool and just kind of stash them in your lineup. Maybe you have secondary waivers in a format like FFPC or NFFC, and you're just looking to clean up and add a couple of these guys, for very cheap. Some of you are obviously in a jam this week and need to cram in a few of these players into your lineups. I know I have lineups that I'm going to be using some of these players in. So, I'm not just talking about them. I'm living it. I'm about this life, and I'm going to be using some of these guys in my lineups. Sometimes you have to just suck it up and play the hand you were dealt in fantasy football. We don't want to be defeated, though, so we want to have process when we're using these sort of sleepers. We're not out here throwing darts. We're looking at players who are readily available, who have a chance to produce for us this week in a very important Week 6 game. But first things first, make sure you take a look at a week ahead. If you can make a couple of small pickups before Sunday's action to get you ready to get you through Week 7 with all those teams on buys, I think you're going to be really happy you did that. Maybe taking an extra 15, 20 minutes looking through all of your leagues on Friday or Saturday or even Sunday morning could pay off big time, and it could save you a lot of fab money because you have to remember there's going to be multiple teams looking for different one-off positions in your league during Week 6, not to mention the free agent pool from Week 7. The free agent pool from Week 7 is going to be even more competitive on waivers as people are looking to fill their lineups, and there's going to be some pretty ugly players started on Week 7. So you want to get ahead. Potentially using a little extra time this week could not only help you win in Week 6, but could also help you win in Week 7. And you could definitely get an edge on your league mates by putting in just a little bit of extra time, grinding, putting the work in, and getting yourself ready. Let's first talk about these quarterbacks. This week is interesting. There's a lot of quarterbacks where we're starting to lose confidence in them. Some for no fault of their own. Kirk Cousins was red hot to start the season. Now we're kind of hesitant to use Kirk Cousins because obviously he loses Justin Jefferson, and the matchup in Chicago on paper is good, but divisional matchups, potential for weather, there's all kinds of factors that make you not want to use Kirk Cousins this week. You've also got Dak Prescott, and it's an incredible fantasy paradox right now because we have the highest Vegas point total of the weekend in the Los Angeles-Dallas game, and yet I don't know. I feel like I can't trust using Dak in some of these lineups. I've looked to break ties. If it comes down to like a Dak versus like a Sam Howell, or I have a league where it's Dak versus Geno Smith off of a bye against a Cincinnati defense that had their moments last week against Arizona, I'm like hesitant using him. He's just been so bad. It's kind of hard to trust him. So we want to talk about a couple of quarterbacks where if you don't like your quarterback's matchup or you feel uneasy about using him, then consider one of these streamers. The first one I want to talk about is Baker Mayfield, and he's available in 74% of Yahoo Leagues. It's gone up quite considerably to have him, rostered in 26% of Yahoo Leagues. This is a guy who was a complete fantasy afterthought, a guy that it would have been kind of funny for me to talk about him in August and be like, oh, I'm going to be talking about Baker Mayfield not only in my sleepers columns, but also in my waiver wire column. But we are here. Daniel Jones is going to miss. We talked about Dak. We talked about Kirk Cousins. There's obviously Aaron Rodgers is done for the season. So there's been some attrition at the position, and Baker Mayfield has been a solid QB2 all season long. And he is coming off of his best game of the year a 3-touchdown performance against New Orleans, where Tampa Bay had a huge win. And he also chipped in 31 rushing yards. So he gives you about 245 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, and he gives you those 31 rushing yards. And it's kind of like all the rushing production for Baker Mayfield has been minimal, but the attempts have been noteworthy. He's had 23 rushing attempts in 4 games. They're giving him like these manufactured looks, and he's also confident as a scrambler. So one of these games, Baker Mayfield is going to just have 55 yards rushing, and you're going to say, okay, well, I wish I started Baker Mayfield this week. They have a difficult matchup against Detroit, but the game flow sounds like the sort of game that could go over. Detroit's offense has just been so explosive that I think Tampa Bay is going to have to keep up. Tampa Bay, off of a bye week, is a live dog this week against Detroit. I think it's going to be a great game, and I think it could be the game where people say, wow, Baker Mayfield is really looking pretty solid. So I'm definitely starting him in a few spots where I'm in a jam, and I think that although Detroit can get to the quarterback, the game flow is definitely going to help him. Desmond Ridder. Okay, don't turn off this video just because I said Desmond Ridder. Don't turn it off. I know it's a weird one to recommend, but Desmond Ridder is coming off of a career-high 329 passing yards in Week 5's win over Houston. Kyle Pitts got it going. Jonnu Smith's been playing well, and it's funny. The Pitts gets the most targets of the season. He gets a season high in catches, a season high in yardage. Ridder goes over 300 yards. So hopefully this is just like a sign of things to come, and we're going to see Pitts being consistently used. Again, I can't trust Arthur Smith, and I really can't trust Desmond Ridder. There's always a chance that the Falcons kind of take the air out of the football and it becomes just a lot of running attempts, especially if they have the game at hand. But Washington has just been so generous to opposing quarterbacks that I think Atlanta is going to have to attack them in that secondary. This has been now 4 straight games where Washington has allowed a 300-yard passing performance. You had Justin Fields, you had Jalen Hurts, you had Josh Allen. You've had all of these quarterbacks just passing at will the last few weeks against Washington. The only quarterback this season that Washington did not allow to have 300 yards passing was Josh Dobbs, and that was game 1 of the season. So Desmond Ridder is a matchup-based play, but streaming him could pay dividends. He could sneak into quarterback 1 territory. I think he's going to be a top 15 quarterback this week based on the play, and we want to target Washington until they show us anything different. Gardner Minshew. Minshew is a fun one this week. Jacksonville has allowed 262.4 passing yards per game. That's a bottom 5 number among all NFL defenses. It's Minshew magic back in Jacksonville. You know, Minshew was like a cult hero. If you played fantasy competitively, back in like 2019, Minshew took over for Nick Foles. Minshew was a 6th round pick. He played for Mike Leach at Washington State, was a 1-year guy for Leach, was like an East Carolina quarterback before Washington State, transfers, goes out and plays for Mike Leach, who's one of my favorite football coaches to ever live. RIP Mike Leach was just an amazing football coach, but Minshew puts up these crazy numbers like a lot of Washington State and Texas Tech quarterbacks did under Leach. But Minshew gets drafted by Jacksonville somewhat as an afterthought, wins the backup job. Nick Foles goes down, and it was Minshew magic. And he was a guy that was very popular, had some fantasy success. Now it comes full circle. He is filling in for a rookie quarterback in Anthony Richardson who went down with an unfortunate shoulder injury. But Minshew has looked good this year. He's played in 3 games now. And again, it's a positive matchup against his former team. We love revenge games. They make for a lot of great content, but it's also this game, he's got the positive matchup. And he's got a real rapport with Michael Pittman and especially Josh Downs, the 3rd rounder from North Carolina, has played so well when Minshew's been behind center. So Gardner Minshew's one I definitely want to consider if I'm in a jam here at quarterback. He's the kind of guy you want to cram in your lineups in Superflex. And you got to feel a little bit better about those Indianapolis pass catching weapons. Running backs. The low-hanging fruit here is Deonta Foreman. Despite being a very popular waiver wire ad, especially in some of these high stakes, he is available still in 72% of Yahoo leagues. I'm recording this on Friday morning, so Deonta Foreman might be there for you for free. He has multiple outs to fantasy production this week. Roschon Johnson may not clear the concussion protocol, and Deonta Foreman would immediately get like RB1 usage and more likely than not be like a high-end RB2 this week if he has the backfield all to himself against Minnesota. Foreman could also just inherit the Khalil Herbert role, and Chicago says, we don't want to put too much on Roschon Johnson, and we're going to kind of keep it a split and give the veteran a lot of these carries. Maybe Roschon sees a little bit more in terms of targets. That's definitely not what we want. Like, in an ideal world, I want Roschon Johnson to get RB1 usage, and I think he could be a huge, huge smash play in the second half of the season. But it doesn't always work out how we want, especially with younger players. And Deonta Foreman was a guy that this coaching staff brought in as a free agent. Again, he plays behind this season because he was beaten out by Roschon, beaten out by Herbert, and he doesn't play special teams. So Travis Homer has had some opportunities ahead of Foreman, but Foreman will immediately step in. This is a guy who's capable. Last year, Christian McCaffrey gets traded to San Francisco. Foreman had a big opportunity in Carolina. He ends up rushing for over 900 yards last year, and he's capable of taking on a high volume of touches. So I'm going to cram in Foreman into some lineups this week. If he's free on your free agent list right now and you could just go grab him in your league, absolutely do that. This is a chance that he has multiple weeks of production, but this is the week you want to circle. This could be the week where he gets, 15 plus carries and a couple of targets. Chuba Hubbard. Chuba Hubbard is not a sleeper. I've talked about him for weeks. I've talked about him, in multiple waiver wire columns for, pretty much since I started writing them. Chuba Hubbard has seen his roster percentage go up and up and up in these Yahoo leagues. He's rostered in 31% of Yahoo leagues now. He's outplaying Miles Sanders. Like anybody watching these games, Chuba Hubbard just looks better than Miles Sanders. Miles Sanders looks banged up, and Miles Sanders is banged up. Miles Sanders now has a shoulder injury. He's also had a groin injury and pec injuries this year. Miles Sanders, the injuries are mounting up. Again, Carolina has a bye week next week. I'm going to bet that Miles Sanders does not play this week. Chuba Hubbard sees a large role, and he's going to give you like low-end RB2 or flex value, probably a high-end RB3 against Miami. But I think he's going to get a lot of touches, and I'm going to, again, be using him in multiple lineups. Keaton Mitchell. Now, this one's a stash. Don't go out and start Keaton Mitchell. We haven't seen anything, but I think he's going to make his season debut. He's practicing, and Baltimore, it's kind of a perfect storm for Keaton Mitchell. Justice Hill and Gus Edwards are veterans. They have familiarity with the Harbaugh offense, but neither one of these guys puts a lot of fear in opposing defenses. Justice Hill was in my waiver wire article this past week. He had one of his best receiving games of the year, and he found the end zone. But the way that game ended against Pittsburgh, 17-10 loss to your bitter rivals. Now you go to London to play Tennessee. This seems like a perfect opportunity to break Keaton Mitchell in, give him some touches in this offense, and see if they could utilize his speed to sort of get this offense going. He is a 4.37 40 guy. This guy has real speed. He was an undrafted free agent, but he still had an incredibly productive career at East Carolina, and he was very fast at the combine. He can catch the football. If you use Jaleel McLaughlin, hopefully you use Jaleel McLaughlin in week 5 and not, last night against Kansas City. That was, an ugly split. But if you kind of think about how Jaleel McLaughlin looked as a receiver and how he injected a little bit of energy into Denver's offense, that's sort of what Keaton Mitchell can offer Baltimore. There's been some whispers that he's like a Tariq Cohen. And if you remember, Tariq Cohen offered you, fantasy production multiple times for Chicago. I don't think he's a Tariq Cohen. I think Tariq Cohen was, I thought Tariq Cohen was really good for a time, but I think Keaton Mitchell could be an effective player this year. I believe we're going to be using Keaton Mitchell in our starting lineups in the second half of the season, at least for a few weeks. That's kind of how excited I am about him. So he's a must stash for me. A great thing about Keaton Mitchell is right now he's still IR eligible in pretty much every single format. So if your league has an IR spot, make sure you grab Keaton Mitchell and let's see how he does in London. I could be completely wrong, but again, a lot of these guys are free. I'm not asking you to spend a ton of fab on them. One guy who you would have to spend some fab on in a lot of high stakes leagues is Kendre Miller, but he's surprisingly available in 85% of Yahoo leagues. I think that there was an initial excitement about Kendre Miller. Some fantasy managers added him. Then he had the backfield all to himself one game and kind of fell flat on his face. It was his first NFL game. He played. He had like 9 carries, and it was kind of nothing type performance. Then Alvin Kamara comes back in week 4, and a lot of people just straight up cut Kendre Miller. Kendre Miller had his best game of the season this past weekend. He had a career-high 90 combined yards. He tied for the Saints' lead in receptions with 4. And this was all with Alvin Kamara having 25 touches. So Kamara had a huge bell cow-like role, and Kendre Miller still was productive. Right now, Kendre Miller is a high-end handcuff, but he could end up becoming like a handcuff plus if New Orleans is going to utilize the running backs. I know there's been a lot of narrative that Kendre Miller did a lot of this in the fourth quarter, and Alvin Kamara was on pace to get an even higher volume game. He would have had 30 touches if the New England game was competitive. But I'm not always so sure about these things because I think that getting Kendre Miller more involved is probably the best thing, not only for Kamara, but also for the Saints offense in general. I think Kendre Miller is a very talented player, and I think he's going to develop into like a handcuff plus. A quick note, Tyjae Spears, just double check, see if anybody's selling him low in your leagues. I'm required to talk about him in every single sleepers video I do here. So it's kind of weird for me not to discuss Tyjae Spears this week. So I just want to give a shout out to Tyjae Spears. If you're listening in on this one, we believe in you. You're a baller. But Spears is rostered in too many leagues for us to discuss now. He's still under 50% rostered, though, in these Yahoo leagues. I think, he should be like a 70% rostered guy. I believe in Tyjae Spears' talent, and I think he's starting to be a thing. We'll see in London if he gets an uptick. Let's talk about some tight ends. Really not as excited about the tight ends I'm going to discuss as the quarterbacks and running backs we just discussed. This is the least exciting position for me compared to wide receiver as well on this list. But let's get through it. Gerald Everett has provided little to no production, and he's been sort of a fantasy afterthought, but he has a chance to turn it around. Los Angeles was on bye week last week. They are, obviously doing some self-scouting, thinking about ways that their offense can improve with this long period of time off. Donald Parham's dealing with a wrist injury, and I think Los Angeles could ramp up Everett's usage, get him a few extra targets. If you recall, he didn't do anything in week 4, but in week 3, he had 6 targets. He caught all of them. This is also like just, they say, watch the tape. Well, watch the tape of Dallas against San Francisco. We're never going to confuse Gerald Everett with George Kittle, but George Kittle had a 3-touchdown smash game last week against Dallas. Dallas was susceptible to the tight end position last week, and I think it's not a crazy bet that Gerald Everett finds the end zone this week. This game has the highest total on the board. It's the Kellen Moore bowl game. Dallas, his old team, against Kellen Moore with his new team, Los Angeles. I'm really excited about this game. I think the game is going to be lit, and I think there's going to be a lot of points. If you have to break ties, cram in one of these Chargers pass catchers and hope for a touchdown. Another player we can always we always play the, hey, let's hope he finds the end zone, is Dawson Knox. Dawson Knox has been a touchdown-dependent guy in his career, but he's attached to Josh Allen. And Dalton Kincaid is in the concussion protocol. So it's been sort of split usage with Knox and Kincaid. But Knox could have the tight end opportunities all to himself this week. Make sure you monitor Knox because he's dealing with a wrist injury himself. And again, he's not really had any production, but it's the New York Giants. Buffalo's going to be aggressive, try to put this game out of hand. And Knox finding the end zone, it seems like if I'm throwing darts at the tight end position and I'm looking for a guy to find the end zone this week, it might be Dawson Knox. And another guy who never finds the end zone, but this week could be the week, is Tyler Conklin. And I should have probably talked about Conklin first. These are not necessarily rankings, but they're kind of rankings for my sleepers. And Conklin is probably the one that I would be most confident cramming in my lineup because he's a very safe floor play. He's been a reliable source of low-end PPR production in every single week that Zach Wilson has been the starter. You've seen Conklin have at least 5 targets in every game with Wilson, and he's coming off of a season-high 67 receiving yards in Week 5's win over Denver. So, we could see Philadelphia revert back to their defensive ways that we saw early in the season where they were really kind of burned at the tight end position. Obviously the TJ Hawkinson game, the Minnesota Philadelphia game, Hawkinson's a really, really talented player, definitely a better player than Conklin. But Hunter Henry burned Philadelphia early in the year. New England kept it close with Philly, and Hunter Henry was the focal point. And then Logan Thomas was on his way to a very good game. He exited the game against Philly. So I'm kind of bullish on Tyler Conklin. I think Conklin could be a fun play this week. The Jets have a little bit of momentum. It's an incredibly difficult matchup. I think Philadelphia takes care of business against the Jets, but do not be surprised if the Jets keep that game extra competitive. And I think Conklin could end up being a big reason why. Look for him to get 5 catches this week. Curtis Samuel. Now, he's not a sleeper. The guy's, some sites will call him a sleeper, but for me, if he's rostered in 32% of Yahoo leagues, that doesn't make him a sleeper. But, it's semantics. I'm nitpicking. He might very well be available in your league. But Curtis Samuel should be rostered in a lot more than 32% of Yahoo leagues. It's a little bit wild. He's had back-to-back games of 18 or more PPR points. Again, Curtis Samuel has had back-to-back games of 18 or more PPR points. He's found the end zone in back-to-back games. He caught a touchdown pass against Chicago. And then the week before, he finds the end zone on a rushing attempt. So you're starting to see Curtis Samuel get at least one rushing attempt a game, which is something we saw at the beginning of last season when he was fantasy relevant. But Curtis Samuel is neck and neck with Terry McLaurin in fantasy scoring among all Washington wide receivers. And he's outproduced Jahan Dotson, his teammate that was drafted way, way, way ahead of him. You saw Dotson steam up in August and September drafts. And Samuel was sometimes drafted, sometimes not drafted. So it's a huge, huge production win for Samuel to outscore Jahan Dotson. And he's, really, really right at the heels of Terry McLaurin right now. So Curtis Samuel, there's something going on with the Sam Howell and Curtis Samuel connection. Definitely take a look and see if he's still available. And if someone has him rostered, make a low ball offer. Or you can also poison pill some of these guys. A poison pill trade offer would be I offer a like-for-like trade, but maybe a slight difference of guys that you have in the same tier where maybe it's a running back for running back deal. And I asked for Curtis Samuel as the throw-in to get the deal done. A lot of fantasy managers will just not even overthink it and will give in a guy like that. They don't necessarily value him as much as he should be valued. A lot of people get in take lock from the summer. And even though we have 5 weeks of sample size, there's still people that are looking at Curtis Samuel's production as not sustaining. And I certainly don't expect him to have 18 points per game again this week, but I think he's going for more than 10 PPR points. And a lot of times in the sleepers, when I'm playing a sleeper, if I get 12 points out of the guy, I'm pretty happy. Look for Curtis Samuel this week against Atlanta to get multiple opportunities to help your fantasy team. Josh Downs. Downs is a guy that I think has been added in a ton of leagues. He went from like a 9% rostered guy when I discussed him last week. And last week he made me look smart. He had 97 receiving yards. I had him as a big waiver wire recommendation. Despite coming off of a poor performance, I knew he would get back and going against Tennessee. And I didn't think he'd go for 97 yards, though. 97 yards was great. He's been a very impressive player. It's been sort of a revenge of these third-round wide receivers. Tank Dell, I had on this sleepers video. He blew up, became a guy that a lot of people were adding. But Tank Dell was a third-round pick. Josh Downs, a third-round pick. Michael Wilson, who we're going to talk about in a second, third-round pick. The third round has been like really poor for wide receivers since Terry McLaurin and Deontay Johnson were drafted in 2019. But this year, the third round guys all look promising, and Downs is a big reason why. Last week, he had a career high 97 receiving yards. Again, we talked about Gardner Minshew, how he has this real chemistry with Downs, and Downs is averaging 11 yards per catch now. There was this misconception early in the season that Downs was going to be like strictly a slot type guy. Maybe, you think about his game against Baltimore where he had 12 targets, 8 catches. Now you're starting to see big plays popping off. And I think if Downs is like a very dynamic, explosive player, and I think he's going to have a few more of these big games, he should have at least a 20% target share this week, if not, something like 23%. It's going to be a very consolidated target tree with Downs and, of course, Michael Pittman. And then you're going to see increased work from Jonathan Taylor and a good amount of touches for the red hot Zach Moss. It's going to be a very easy team to predict for Indianapolis and their fantasy production. And we love these teams when we kind of can predict them week to week. But Josh Downs is a player that is at least a flex or wide receiver 3 in every single week that Gardner Minshew starts. Just put him in your lineup and understand that Josh Downs could give you a week like last week or a week like he had against Baltimore any single time Minshew's behind center. Michael Wilson. We just talked about third-round wide receivers. Wilson was a guy that I've talked about in my waiver wire column, also in the sleepers videos. And he had 2 really, really good weeks in a row. In week 3 and week 4, he combined for 9 catches, 162 yards receiving, and 2 touchdowns. He made the big play downfield against Dallas in Arizona's big win over Dallas. And he had 2 touchdown catches against San Francisco, which is an impressive feat. And Wilson was invisible against Cincinnati. Worst production he's had as a pro. And now they're playing the Los Angeles Rams as underdogs. The Rams have been stingy against opposing wide receivers. There's been some instances where they've gotten burned as well. But for the most part, the Los Angeles Rams have been strong against the wideout. I think Wilson's going to get opportunities, though, this week. We had one huge positive for Wilson is he played in a season-high 75% of snaps last week. So the usage wasn't there, but there was an uptick in playing time, and opportunities will come if he's on the field 75% of the time. I think you'll see a couple of downfield shots for Wilson. He could be a guy where if I'm in real trouble this week, I could put him in my lineup. Now let's talk about a few veterans. DJ Shark returns to Florida, where he had his most fantasy success of his career in Jacksonville. Carolina passing attack is completely centered around Adam Thielen, but Shark could see some additional targets because Carolina's facing off against a fantasy buzzsaw in the Miami Dolphins. The Dolphins are an offensive juggernaut, and they put pressure on opponents to kind of take shots to try to keep up. Shark has caught a touchdown in 2 of his last 3 games. There's also potential you get a lot of garbage time in this game. Miami could put it on Carolina. Kendrick Bourne. This is a gross one. Kendrick Bourne is a guy that I talked about early in the season. I was intrigued by the passing volume in New England and also intrigued by Kendrick Bourne getting 19 targets in his first 2 games of the season. He's only had 13 targets in the 3 games since. Again, this has been a murderer's row of defenses for New England to go up against. Dallas, New Orleans, the New York Jets, all very strong defenses, but the Patriots were completely wiped out, annihilated these last 3 games. This has been a really, really ugly performance. Last week, New Orleans was like the low of the low. New Orleans completely dominated start to finish against New England. But Kendrick Bourne did lead New England in receiving yards. He had 43, which is ugly. I'm not like hyping a guy with 43 yards, but I think this week he could actually see an uptick, get back, closer to the 7+ targets we saw early in the season. And the Raiders defense is not the worst defense in the league, but they're certainly not the best. And it's going to be a kind of a sigh of relief for New England's offense. I think they're going to have a chance to do, a little bit better this week against a much, much easier to go up against defense. Robert Woods, he's been banged up with a rib injury, so keep an eye on the practice reports. Make sure he practiced Friday. But Tank Dell's going to be out with a concussion. And Robert Woods, this is just a volume play. He's kind of like the Tyler Conklin of wide receivers. Robert Woods has had 6 targets in every game this season or more, which is wild. He's had 40 targets on the year. He has more targets than Nico Collins, more targets than Tank Dell. It's kind of crazy unless you're actually like looking through the box scores, because Woods has not really put up fantasy production, but the targets are there, and I think he could see an uptick against a very tough New Orleans defense. New Orleans is going to really focus on Nico Collins, especially with Tank Dell out. So Robert Woods could be a guy that catches, 5 or 6 passes, gets you 45 to 60 yards receiving. He could have that sort of a stat line. So understand what you're dealing with. We're kind of chasing a 12-pointer with Robert Woods, but he certainly will have the volume opportunities to do so. Stick with us here at Player Profiler all year long. We've got you covered not only with our podcasts, not only with, the shows we're putting out, but also with the articles we're putting out on playerprofiler.com. If you enjoy this Sleepers video, it also comes out as an article, usually on Fridays. I also write the waiver wire column that drops Mondays. The waiver wire column, which drops Tuesdays. And then I write the 2-minute drill, which is my biggest fantasy takeaways from the weekend. And that drops on Mondays. And then find these videos. These videos are just right here on our YouTube page. And check out all the shows I recorded this week. I had Adam Levitan of Establish the Run on press coverage. I had John Daigle on First Class Fantasy, the show that I host with Billy Muzio. And I co-hosted the Fantasy Empire. I filled in Fernando DeFino, and I sat down with Chris Vaccaro for that show. That was a really fun one. So check out all of our shows. We've got you covered. Make sure you're taking a look ahead. Those bye weeks, do not let them catch up with you. You want to be a week ahead on bye weeks. Stick with us all season long. We want to see you win titles. We want to see you win some money, and we got you covered at Player Profiler. Let's crush